Professor Wilson, welcome to the summit. For anyone that isn't aware of your work, could you just tell us a bit more about your background and what you do?
Sure. I am a social psychologist by trade, and that is a subdiscipline of psychology that looks at how people are influenced by their perceptions of others primarily, and the way they view the world in a social context. So much of my work has looked at people's mindsets or stories of themselves and others and how that shapes their behavior. I've been teaching at the University of Virginia now for a long time, several decades, and publishing my work in various outlets and really enjoying it. It's a good life.
Brilliant. And what initially got you interested in becoming a social psychologist?
Well, to me, it's a great blend between science and social action. So, I grew up in the 1960s in a time that, and it's funny, the turmoil of today's world reminds me in some ways of when I came of age in the 1960s. There are differences, of course, but the 1960s were a time of great social upheaval, civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and I really wanted to do something, and I did. I was a demonstrator. I was out there in the streets to some extent. But to me, social psychology takes an approach that says, well, what works and how do we know whether something works? So it's very much science-based of testing various interventions and seeing if they work. And there's too little of that in my view. One thing I talk about in my book, Redirect, is how there are so many programs out there that haven't been tested and some of them doing more harm than good. So, to me, it's just a wonderful blend, as I said, of hard-nosed science and an attempt to find solutions to social problems.
That's really interesting. Now, your first book, or your first popular book, was called Strangers to Ourselves. And first, I'm just curious, why did you choose that title?
Well, it's actually a quote from Nietzsche. I came across it at one time, and to me, it just captures the theme of the book, which is that it's very hard to get to know ourselves through direct introspection. There are limits to what we can, the knowledge we can gain through navel gazing. And so what do? So to try to understand ourselves, we often need to think of ourselves as another person in a sense and develop a story, get what information we have, integrate it as best we can into a narrative about ourselves, just as we do for strangers. Now, of course, we have much more information about ourselves than we do about strangers, but nonetheless, there are parallels to how we get to know other people and how we get to know ourselves.
Are there any things that you would recommend people to do to get to better know themselves, like some practical things people can do that maybe you've discovered through your research for becoming more self-aware?
Well, I do think being astute observers of ourselves is really important. And to perhaps not rely too much on navel-gazing introspection. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with thinking about ourselves and trying to decipher how we feel about something or why we did what we did. But I think some of my research says we can carry that too far and place too much faith on introspection. And I think a good guide is to watch what we do as a clue to how we feel. If we're unsure how we feel about something, how we feel about another person, for example, of course, search our feelings and try to decipher them, but also, are you always texting the person? Are you avoiding the person at all costs? What are you actually doing in that relationship can be a good clue to how you really feel.
Interesting. So our actions are often more honest or more truthful than our words in some sense.
Well, they can be, and particularly in those situations where we're uncertain how we feel about something. I mean, sometimes we know darn well that we love somebody or we we like a particular food or whatever. But in times when we're unsure of our feelings, I think watching what we do is at least should be considered as a source of information.
Yeah. Okay. So this whole summit is organized kind of around the theme of behavior change, right? And different approaches to change. So I'd be curious to ask you, Professor Wilson, what would you say are the primary causes of human behavior? Because I know you've done a lot of work on the unconscious and around that area. So what would your thoughts on that be?
Well, that's a big question. And it's interesting. I'm actually working on a paper right now that's trying to explain the social psychological insight to that question. Because of course there are widely different approaches. If we want to know why people do what they do, we could invoke an evolutionary approach, try to look in our distant past and see what natural selection, how it shaped us. We could put ourselves in scanners and see what parts of our brain are lighting up. And there's nothing wrong with those approaches, but I do think social psychology has a unique approach, which is to look at people's contemporaneous construals about themselves in the situation. Now, construals is an awkward word. It's one we social psychologists love, but it basically means just how we are currently interpreting the world. And there's a way in which that's obvious. Of course, we have to know the filters by which we're looking at the world and the assumptions we're making. But this is a lesson that dates back to Kurt Lewin, who was kind of the father of social psychology, that yes, historical approaches are important, the brain is important, but if you really want to predict what people do, look at their current interpretation of what's going on and why they're doing it. And that can be vastly influenced by the social situation, that sometimes we're in situations where it's not our evolutionary history, or it's how that situation is shaping our view of, for example, whether this is a welcoming environment for us or one where we feel at risk and not welcomed. How we interpret an interaction with another person, are they acting aggressively towards me or not, or do they like me? I mean, we're constantly making these spins or construals. And if you really want to know what people are going to do, get inside their head and try to see how they see the world.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that kind of leads well into my next question. So your latest book is called Redirect, The New Science of Psychological Change. Firstly, I want to ask, why did you write this book?
Well, really two reasons. One of the themes of the book is that when we're trying to change behavior, and particularly when we're putting social programs into place or new educational advances, they're not tested enough. As I said before, I think we know how to test programs, whether they work, and there's many examples of some of them quite tragic, of programs that did more harm than good. But perhaps more importantly, I do think this social psychological insight about construals, or stories is the metaphor I use in the book, is a real way to leverage change. And the book goes over many different examples. It's not just about one kind of change. It talks about everything from parenting to personal happiness to adolescent behavior problems. And what those have in common is there's research showing that you can change people for the better by changing their stories.
And that was something I noticed in the book, is that there are a lot of interventions and things that happen that haven't been scientifically tested. And we seem to rely a lot on common sense. Why do you think we do this? And how can we get policymakers to start using more rigorously tested approaches?
Well, good question. And, I think it's because psychology involves common sense, I think. So, if I told you that I had been spending this time sheltering at home in my basement, mixing up a a cure for a disease, and that I think I had found the cure for diabetes, say, and I'd now like to go out and give it to everyone in the world, I think most of us would say, well, wait a minute, that you need to test that. That could do a lot more harm than good, particularly because I'm not a physician. But when it comes to social, we don't have intuitions about what would cure diabetes. So it doesn't, if I were to tell you I have a new approach, it doesn't really violate your common sense. But when it comes to social programs, one of my favorite examples is a program in the States called Scared Straight, which has been around for over 20 years. And the idea is to take teenagers who are at risk for behavioral problems and take them to a prison and have hardened criminals, many of whom have life sentences, scare them into being straight. So the criminals yell and scream at them and say, don't end up like me. You've got to walk a straighter path. That makes a lot of common sense, that if you saw what might happen to you in prison, that would make you think twice about committing some criminal act. And indeed, it was put into place. There's an award-winning documentary about it before it was put to a rigorous test. Well, finally, people did in several studies. They randomly assigned kids to go through this program or to a control group that didn't. And guess what? It actually does more harm than good. There are, at my last count, 7 studies, all of which show that the kids who go through this program are more likely to commit crimes than the control group. Now, we don't fully understand why. One possibility is, turns out with at-risk teens, one of the worst things you can do is bring them together and have them try to impress each other and care more about what their peers think than what adults think. And I think there are some other reasons why it backfired, but the number of crimes that have been committed because of this program is not trivial. And there are many examples like that of where it just, something that seems to make sense isn't always the right approach. Now, how to get policymakers to adopt this? Well, we're making some inroads. It's slow. My wife actually is a politician. She was on the city council in Charlottesville, and she has carried my message forward but it's not always easy, because when you say to someone who has a program, well, have you tested it? They believe it works, and it looks like you're being really critical, that you're not believing what they're doing, and the message has to be conveyed that it's in your interest to test your program rigorously, because you'll find out how to make it better. We'll discover what's working and what isn't, and that will tell us ways to improve your program. But progress is sometimes slow.
That's incredible. That the Scare Straight program can actually lead to kids committing more crime than those that aren't exposed to it. Something else you mentioned in the book is about just the importance for people that are doing these studies and trying to get these things going is to start small and then take it from there, as opposed to a big scale intervention. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's another lesson we've learned, that it's quite expensive to start a national program on something. And another example is how to reduce child abuse. And in the States, there are some national programs that are put into place at the tune of millions of dollars. And at least the early returns on these programs is they're not working very well, if at all. Some researchers in California did a small pilot program to try a different approach, in which they had home visitors who were assigned to at-risk parents shape their narrative about why their kids were misbehaving. And it was a really simple technique, and it led to a dramatic decrease in child abuse. And we know that because it was a well-tested program with all the right control groups. Now, this I think the first study that did this, I don't remember the exact number of mothers, but it was probably 100 or so. And, but the advantage of starting small was you could do it very rigorously and control the study and do it cheaply, frankly, because who knows if it's going to work. Once this researcher got some good early returns, she replicated the study 2 or 3 times. And I mean, there's a whole nother set of issues with how you scale up a program. But I do think that starting small and showing at least in one context that works well, instead of throwing millions of dollars and hoping it works everywhere is the way to go.
For sure, for sure. So a central theme of the book, and maybe the idea that the book is kind of organized around, is this idea of story editing. So what is story editing, and what would you say are the core assumptions that this approach is built upon?
Sure. Well, when we think about behavior change, trying to change someone's behavior for ways that are beneficial for that person and for people around them, I think our first thought is often, well, it's hard. You know, people are often stuck in their ways through the way they were raised or the culture they were brought up in or the norms of their community. And it's also the case they're often in situations that make change very difficult, that the institutional and structural issues are very hard to overcome. I'm thinking of educational contexts, so where kids are going to terrible schools and so it seems, you know, where do you start is often the question. And again, as I was saying about social psychology's assumption about construals, or stories as I call them in the book, is, well, even in the best of environments, it matters a lot how the individual perceives his or her situation. They can make maladaptive assumptions about how they fit into this setting, what their prospects are. And that is a really good place to intervene, to try to change that story they're telling themselves. Let's take the school example, that there's a lot of research in social psychology on how minority and underrepresented minorities are faring in our schools, which is not very well. And one reason for that may be they may perceive quite accurately that this is not an environment that was created for them and that they don't feel welcome in. Now, one obvious approach is change that environment. And I want to be very clear that I endorse that the social psychology approach isn't in place of structural and institutional change. There's lots of change we need. The current movement we're in with Black Lives Matter, I think, has highlighted a lot of those, that police departments need to be restructured, in my view, and there's a lot of institutional racism out there. So let me be very clear that I'm fully on board with all that kind of change. But I think what we miss sometimes is we can also intervene at the level of the individual's story that they tell themselves. And in the case of underrepresented minorities in school, there's been some quite successful interventions to, with fairly simple approaches, try to convey the message that, you know, a lot of people stumble at first academically in a new environment when they're starting college or starting high school. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do it or that this is a poor environment for you. It may just mean you have to find new strategies, and those simple messages have pretty remarkable effects.
Interesting. Now, another thing that you mentioned in the book is something known as story prompting. So could you tell us a bit more about what this is and maybe give us an example of it in action?
Sure. So, you know, if we make the assumption that people's stories are a good place to intervene to give them healthier mindsets, the question is how to do it. And there are a variety of approaches. And story prompting is one where a third party comes in and tries to help an individual edit his or her story. They're not heavy-handed approaches, and in many of the studies, the individual doesn't even know that there's a story editing, or it's not that they don't know, it's that it's not heavy-handed in the sense that we say, I'm going to change your story. It's more, here's some information that you might or might not want to use. So an example, one of the first studies I did after I finished graduate school was a intervention with first year college students who were stumbling academically. And we brought them into the psychology building one by one and told them we had a survey for them. But before they did our survey, we wanted to tell them some of the results we'd found so far. And in our treatment condition, they got real statistics showing that, a lot of first year students do poorly at first, but they learn the ropes and their grades get better. And we reinforced that by showing them brief videotaped interviews of older students who said, yeah, my first year was a train wreck, but I learned how to study better and I'm doing just fine now, that kind of story. Others were randomly assigned to a control group that just saw some unrelated statistics about academic achievement. This took about a half an hour. The reason I call it story prompting is, we weren't telling them, hey, you should adopt the story that you can do it. It was more of a prompt so that we thought might actually work better by being less heavy-handed, a prompt to consider another explanation for why they were doing poorly. We sat back and waited and then looked at their grades at the end of the year, and it was the case that those who got this story prompts actually did better academically than the control group who did not. Now, let me add, this wasn't a huge effect. It's not the case that someone who was getting C's suddenly turned into an A student, but it was a statistically non-trivial effect of grades going up a little if they got this story prompt and pretty much staying the same if they did not. There are lots of examples of that, of these little prompts. Another way I think about it is there are lots of times in life when we're kind of at a narrative fork in the road. Something bad has happened to us. A relationship is going sour, or we're not doing well academically, and we have to come up with an explanation of that, a story. We tell ourselves a story as to why that is the case. And unfortunately, some people are prone to go down this self-defeating road of, oh, this shows I'm hopeless, I can't do it, why even try? I'm not suited for this college, I should drop out. And that is self-defeating because it builds on itself. Once you tell yourself that story, it's pretty hard to get out of it, and you stop studying and you get more bad grades. Or you can go down this other fork where you say, okay, this is a wake-up call. I need to learn how to study better, maybe go see the professor in the office hours, what have you. And that can be self-enhancing because you try a new strategy, and if you get positive feedback, that reinforces the idea that you can do it. But when you're at that narrative fork, I think that's where story prompting comes in, just giving people a little nudge to go down the positive path instead of the negative one can reap dividends.
I think that's so powerful. When I was reading your book, I was actually reminded of, I'm type 1 diabetic, and I was diagnosed when I was 6. And around that time, my parents told me, actually, this is probably going to be the best thing that ever happens to you, because it's going to force you to really look after your diet. You're going to have to exercise a lot. It's going to make you healthier than your friends. And just because they planted that narrative in my head, I think that had a massive effect on my behavior over time. And it's kind of came true. I really do look after my diet. I exercise regularly. And it was just a simple shift in the story that I was told,
That's great. I didn't know that when I used the diabetes example earlier. Sorry about that. But it reminds me of another story I'm really fond of that I heard on the podcast This American Life, and it's about a man named Daniel Kish, and he became totally blind when he was an infant, 15 months old. He had a childhood disease. And his mother decided she was going to treat him like a sighted person, that she was not going to treat this as a disability. She encouraged him to go out and play in the yard and to climb trees, to learn how to fend for himself. And with remarkable results that he actually developed a form of echolocation where he clicks his tongue and it's like a bat, the sound bounces off and he can navigate. So he goes mountain biking now. He's an adult. He hikes. You wouldn't know that he was blind if you just ran into him at first. And I mean, I love that example for a lot of reasons. That of course we should not change just the story. That if there were cures for his disease, we should of course find them. And it's not that we shouldn't change the objective environment. But we're dealt with what we have, sometimes we're dealt bad environments. And I think the story we tell ourselves is really critical.
For sure. And a big theme of this seems to be that these small interventions lead to sustained change. They seem to have snowball effects. Could you maybe talk a bit more about that?
They can, and I think it's very clear that happens. We're still trying to understand exactly why, but another example done by some other researchers, they looked at adjustment to college as well, but they were interested in particularly how minority students, African Americans in particular, would adapt to this college that was a primarily white environment. And they did one of these story prompting studies where in the first year of college, they brought these students in and gave them, their intervention lasted about an hour. And there again, they saw some older students talking about how, it can be tough at first, but it doesn't mean you don't fit in. You just have to try a little harder and so on. And they tracked these students for now several years. And by the end of college, they had a higher GPA and than a control condition. They were healthier. And they're now, I believe, somewhere around 8 or 9 years after the study, and they're actually doing better in their careers. And so how can this 1 hour cause this lasting change? Well, there's some hints from the study that they had people keep a diary for the week after the study. And when they looked at what people wrote, the ones who had gotten the treatment, the story prompts, were more apt to interpret adverse events in a positive way. So say they're sitting in their room home on a Friday night and no one's invited them out to do anything and they're feeling lonely. They were more apt to say things like, not that, oh, I'm really homesick, that they're saying, well, maybe I should call somebody up. I should try a little harder. If memory serves, they were more apt to seek out mentors than the control group. So they instigated changes in their lives that made this snowball. It wasn't just that they had something in their heads. They actually changed their environments in ways. In fact, when the kids graduated, the researchers asked them, do you remember being in a study, in your first year? And what did you think, what effect do you think it had on you? And they barely remembered it. Mom said, I have a vague memory of coming to your laboratory, but I don't really remember what we did or what we said. It was the change that happened as a result of that was really key.
That's interesting. Could you tell us about the do good, be good principle?
Yeah, that's another one of my favorites. So, another way to change our stories, interestingly, is to change what we do. And this is a principle, it dates back to Aristotle, who talked about if you want to change yourself, change your habits, change your behavior. And there's some research that, for example, with depressed people that if you can convince them to just get out and see a friend, get out and act in a non-depressed way, make an effort, do some volunteer work, that can help just to get them out of their heads and acting more positively. And there's some really cool studies showing that indeed helping or getting high school students to do volunteer work as part of their academic requirements can shape their self-views in positive ways. So you're changing their behavior first. So you're getting them to pick a community agency and volunteer once a week to go to a daycare center or a homeless shelter. And it harks back to something I said earlier about being good observers of ourselves. I think these kids, at some level, maybe not consciously, we're watching what they do and drawing inferences about themselves and saying, I'm the kind of person who volunteers and helps others. And that actually improved their grades and reduced teenage pregnancy in one study as a result of that. So it's something I try to do. If I'm feeling down or I feel, I want to feel better about myself, just get out and do something and help someone else. Even a little thing, help a neighbor. You just feel better about yourself.
100%, 100%. So in the book, there's a whole chapter on happiness and how we can kind of use some of these principles to be happier in day-to-day life. And I think there's 3 perspectives you mentioned that are critical for happiness. Do you remember what these are? And maybe if you could tell us a bit more about those.
Yeah, I think, it's not rocket science. I think we need to have a sense of hope, meaning, and purpose. Hope being a sense of optimism. There's lots of research showing that people who are optimistic tend to have better outcomes than those who aren't, better health outcomes. So doing what we can to see the glass as half full instead of half empty is important. Having a sense of purpose, that there's a point to what we're doing is important, and that can take many forms. It could be through one's work, through a religious endeavor or whatever, but just to have a sense that we're working towards something that's important. And then a sense of meaning that it's that's related to purpose, but the idea that there's some explanation for what we do. And again, that's often a religious one for people who are religious, but it doesn't have to be if people can find a source of meaning in whatever, their hobbies, their work. That's really important. How to get these things? Well, there's some really nice writing exercises that have been developed. The best known one is developed by a social psychologist named James Pennebaker, who finds that if something's troubling you that you can't quite get beyond, something that happened to you or whatever, let a little time pass. That's a critical part of it. And then take out a piece of paper and for maybe 15 minutes, just write about your rawest thoughts and feelings about it. And do that maybe 2 or 3 nights in a row. It's hard. People in these studies often cry when they do it. It's difficult to confront this thing that is troubling us. But by so doing, people often find new meaning in it. They're able to wrap it up and put it behind them more because they put a new structure around it. And there's lots of studies that show, good studies, that this can improve people's health, lower post-traumatic stress syndrome in soldiers, by leading to a better story, essentially, through writing.
Yeah, no, we actually interviewed Dr. Pennebaker for the summaries in day 2. But no, his work is really, really interesting. One of the
he's an old friend, and I'm a big fan of his work.
Okay, small world. One of the things I found really interesting that you said in the book is this whole idea around core narratives. And, because we have this capacity to contemplate our existence in the grand scheme of the universe, this is, if you ever sit down to think about it, it's quite a almost terrifying thought sometimes. So we have these stories that give our lives significance and meaning within those contexts. And for the longest time, religions provided that context. But now we're maybe in a more secular society than we have been in the past. And I'm just curious, do you think that this absence of a core narrative that many people experience, do you think this might be linked with mental health problems? Do you think that there might be some kind of link there? Or I'd just be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it's certainly not a good state to be in. You know, it reminds me of a cartoon. You know, there's a whole series of cartoons where someone has scaled a mountain to find the guru to discover what the meaning of life is. And it's always funny what they discover. And there's one where this guy has scaled and he's reached the top, and the girl is sitting there in a yoga position with a t-shirt that says, "Life is a bitch and then you die." That is not a good that is not a good narrative. And so I think, yes, it's really important to find some purpose and meaning. And you know, that's hard sometimes. But it's, you know, I think, again, getting out of our shell and out there in the world is the way to do it. I think of all the activism going on in the streets of America and elsewhere right now. These are people, many of them young people, who have found a new purpose, and it's a really important one. And I would bet they are feeling good about it, in the sense of, you know, this is something they're acting towards. They feel like they're making a difference. I hope they are. And so, you know, whether it's a social cause or a personal endeavor, you know, having some sense of meaning and purpose is so crucial.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Another thing that you mentioned, another writing exercise, was this, I think it was called the best possible self exercise, where maybe you could tell us a bit more about the details of it, where people write about their ideal life.
Sure. Well, you know, there's less research on this, but it's growing. And the idea is to, rather than writing about something that's troubling you, to write about a positive self that you might achieve in the future. And so think about your life 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, and think about the person that you might want to become, be it personally or professionally or relationship-wise or whatever, and just write about that outcome. Now, a really critical part of this is it's important to also write about steps you can take to get there. Just imagining yourself in the future. You know, there's lots of self-help books on positive thinking, and you know, it can make us feel good to think that, you know, 5 years from now I'm going to be a millionaire and have made all these changes in my life. But you know, you need to connect the dots and say, and here's the things I can do to get there. And if you do both of those, it can make us feel better in the present and make you more apt to actually get there.
So it's critical to focus on the process of how you're actually going to get to where
I think so.
And that's maybe why in the book you give there's a book called The Secret, and you give that quite a hard time, and a lot of debunk in there. But
well, you know, maybe it was out of jealousy of how many copies that book is. But you know, there's nothing wrong with positive thinking until you, as that book suggests, you can throw away your medicines because it will cure diseases, and money will come to you. I mean, they really take it to absurd extremes that all I have to do is imagine something happening to me and it will. It's not quite as simple as that.
One of the things that struck me when I was, you know, researching this was there seems to be parallels here with Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset. And that seems to be, would you say that's a form of story editing in itself?
I would, and I'm a big fan of that work. It is actually one problem with my field is we have too many terms for similar things. So, you know, Carol likes the word mindsets, which is a great one. She tends to use it specifically about our own abilities and personality as to whether that's a fixed thing or something I can change. To me, that's a very important form of a story we tell ourselves. But there are other stories about other aspects of our lives that are important as well. But she's done really important work on showing, again, I would classify a lot of her interventions as story prompting ones, where say 9th grade students are given some information suggesting a new way of looking at their own intelligence. And in one national study she and her colleagues did that occurred twice as part of their schoolwork, a couple of weeks apart. And by the end of the semester, those who got that message had better grades, particularly those who were underperforming to start with. So yes, I put that under the same umbrella.
Okay. And my question next would be, how do people actually, like for someone sitting at home watching this, how would they actually practically apply this in their life? Like what advice would you give to someone that wants to make changes to their behavior?
Well, it is tricky because some of the story change techniques I talk about are best imposed by a third party, such as in schools by teachers and so on. But a couple of the ones we've mentioned, certainly we could do ourselves. And one are the writing exercises that Jamie Pennebaker has championed. There is another version of that other researchers have done that says a critical part of that is to view yourself in a third person, to write about yourself as if you're writing about somebody else. Use your name. So instead of saying, oh, I was feeling this, I would say, oh, Tim was feeling this and Tim did that. And to think about why you did what you did. And that's a particularly effective way to come up with a new meaning for what happened to you. But the do good, be good principle we talked about of changing our behavior, we could all do, any time of trying to act in a different way, take small steps. Another one I've tried, I consider myself to be on the introverted side. If I travel somewhere, I tend not to talk to my seatmates. I tend to be buried in a book. But there's actually some research showing that travel's more fun if you actually chat with people. and so I've tried, okay, I'm going to try that. I'm going to make a point of getting out of my shell and chatting with the person next to me. And, I don't always do it because I like to read my book too, but it generally works. That people are, it is fun to chat with someone for a little while. And I mean, that took a little effort to actually do, but, little things like that of just acting more in ways we want to be. There's a famous Kurt Vonnegut quote that I'm probably going to butcher, but it's, be careful of what you pretend to be because you become what you pretend to be. So
that's brilliant. So Professor Wilson, it's been fascinating to talk to you. I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time. Before we go here, is there anywhere you would like to send people online, perhaps a website or anything you'd recommend people to check out?
Well, I don't have much of my work on the web, but there are ones out there. You mentioned Carol Dweck's work. There's something called the Mind Scholars Network. Just Google Mind Scholar Network is lots of research on changing mindsets from her perspective and others. There is another website, actually, particularly for those interested in the research, that a researcher at Stanford, Greg Walton, has put together. If you Google WISE, W-I-S-E, interventions, he's put together a database of all the studies that have been done in this area. Again, this is a terminological thing. I think story editing and WISE interventions are basically the same thing. But he has a very nice database where you can plug in terms and see what research has been done.
Fantastic. Well, we'll link to this in the show notes for the interview underneath the video. So again, Professor Wilson, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, Niall, it's been a pleasure for me too. Thanks for inviting me.